Hey there. Tonight the journey begins into one of history's most fascinating and genuinely unsettling topics, the medieval fear of darkness. When the sun disappeared below the horizon in medieval Europe, the world didn't just grow dim, it transformed entirely, becoming a realm where familiar villages turned sinister, where every shadow held potential danger, and where the line between reality and nightmare blurred into something neither quite physical nor fully imagined. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of deep, historical exploration genuinely interests you. And drop a comment about where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see the community gathered from all corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's step together into the medieval night, where fear was not just reasonable, it was practically mandatory. When thinking about medieval life, the mind might conjure images of bustling market squares, grand castles, and colourful festivals. But there was another side to medieval existence, one that began precisely when daylight faded. For the average person living in medieval Europe, nightfall wasn't simply the end of the workday or a signal to light some candles and relax. It was the beginning of a fundamentally different world. Picture this: a small village, maybe 30 or 40 humble dwellings clustered together, surrounded by dense forest and miles of empty countryside. As the sun begins its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, an almost palpable shift occurs in the atmosphere. Families hurry to complete final tasks. Animals are secured in pens, doors are bolted, shutters are fastened tight. There's an urgency to these movements, an unspoken understanding that lingering outside after dark is, well, unwise. Because once that sun dipped below the horizon, the village essentially became an island cut off from the outside world, vulnerable in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend. No streetlights would illuminate the pathways. No watchmen patrolled with flashlights. No one could simply pick up a phone and call for help. The darkness was absolute, thick, almost tangible. And in that darkness, anything could be hiding. Anything at all. The medieval relationship with night was complicated, layered with practical concerns, cultural beliefs, religious teachings, and genuine dangers that made fear not just understandable but entirely rational. Darkness brought real threats. Wild animals prowled. Criminals operated freely. Accidents happened with alarming frequency. And beyond these tangible dangers lurked something even more troubling to the medieval mind, the supernatural, the demonic, the forces of opposition that church teachings insisted grew stronger when light disappeared. Medieval people weren't being irrational or primitive when they feared the night. They were responding to their reality with the tools and understanding available to them. In a world without modern lighting, without reliable law enforcement, without scientific explanations for strange sounds or mysterious phenomena, nighttime genuinely was dangerous. The fear was earned through centuries of experience, passed down through generations in stories, sermons, and the hard-won wisdom of survival. And so, as twilight descended, medieval communities transformed. The bustling, lively villages of daytime became silent, shuttered fortresses against the dark. Families huddled close to hearth fires, children were warned against approaching windows, prayers were whispered with particular fervour, because everyone understood one simple, undeniable truth. Night belonged to something else, something that did not have humanity's best interests at heart. The challenge was surviving until dawn. Modern people living in cities and towns perpetually bathed in artificial light can scarcely imagine true darkness. There's always something glowing: streetlights, porch lights, the soft illumination from windows, the distant glow of urban centres painting the night sky. Even in rural areas, light switches are merely an arm's reach away, ready to banish darkness at the slightest hint of discomfort. Medieval nights offered no such comfort. When the sun vanished, the world plunged into a blackness so complete, it was almost physical, pressing against the eyes, swallowing every familiar landmark, transforming even well-known paths into treacherous unknowns. This wasn't the romantic, softly shadowed darkness of movies. This was absolute, disorienting, genuinely frightening darkness. The primary source of light after sunset was fire, candles, oil lamps, torches, and the central hearth that burned in most homes. But these were precious, limited resources. Candles were expensive, crafted from tallow or beeswax and reserved for special occasions or the wealthy. Oil for lamps was similarly costly. Torches burned quickly and required constant replacement. For the average peasant family, the evening's illumination might consist of a single guttering candle or the flickering light from the cooking fire, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts cosy and unsettling. Beyond the small circle of firelight, darkness reigned supreme. Looking out a window on a moonless night revealed nothing. No shapes, no silhouettes, no comforting sense of the world continuing beyond the glass. Just an impenetrable wall of black. Villages, already small and isolated during the day, became even more so at night. Neighbours living just a few houses away might as well have been miles distant. Without light to guide the way, venturing outside after dark meant stumbling through invisible landscapes, hands outstretched, feet testing each step, never quite certain what might be encountered in the next moment. The darkness affected everything. Work became impossible. Most labour required daylight, so productivity halted when the sun set. Social gatherings were limited to those already under the same roof. Travel was virtually unthinkable unless absolutely necessary. Time itself seemed to slow and stretch, with families having no reliable way to track the hours until dawn. Sundials were useless, water clocks and hourglasses were rare and imprecise. The night simply lasted, and lasted, and lasted. People would go to sleep not long after sunset, not necessarily because they were tired, but because there was little else to do. Lying in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside, the wind, the animals, the creaking of wooden buildings settling, there was plenty of time to think, plenty of time to wonder, plenty of time for the imagination to run wild with possibilities. What was that sound? Just the wind, or something else? Was that movement glimpsed at the edge of the firelight real, or a trick of shadows? Medieval people spent a significant portion of their lives in this state, in darkness, in uncertainty, in a world where the familiar became strange and the strange became terrifyingly plausible. The psychological impact of such profound darkness cannot be overstated. Modern research has shown that humans have an innate wariness of darkness, an evolutionary holdover from times when predators hunted at night. Medieval people lived with this primal fear activated every single night, for years, for decades, for entire lifetimes. And unlike modern humans who can dismiss nighttime anxieties as irrational and flip on a light for reassurance, medieval people had no such option. The darkness was real, the dangers were real, the fear was entirely justified. When the moon was full, it provided some relief, bathing the landscape in silvery illumination that allowed at least some navigation and visibility. But even moonlight was unpredictable, obscured by clouds, absent during the new moon phase, and creating its own unsettling shadows that could deceive and disorient. And on nights when clouds covered the sky completely, when neither moon nor stars offered even a glimmer of light, the darkness reached a depth that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. In this world of absolute darkness, the medieval mind sought explanations and protections. If light was safety, and darkness was danger, then keeping the light alive became not just practical, but spiritually significant. The hearth fire was more than a source of warmth and cooking. It was a beacon, a guardian, a tangible piece of security against the vast unknown pressing in from all sides. Letting the fire die was unthinkable, akin to inviting disaster. Because once that last ember faded, once that final flicker of light disappeared, there was nothing standing between the family and the complete, total, overwhelming darkness. And in that darkness, according to everything medieval people believed and experienced, danger waited with infinite patience. The quality of darkness varied with the seasons as well. Summer nights, though warmer, were still pitch black once the sun set. But winter darkness was something altogether more oppressive. Not only did it arrive earlier and linger longer, stretching from late afternoon until well into the next morning, but it came with bone-chilling cold that made the hours seem to extend infinitely. Winter nights in medieval Europe could last 14, 15, even 16 hours in northern regions, an eternity of cold blackness that tested human endurance to its limits. During these extended winter nights, families had no choice but to remain indoors for what felt like days. The precious firewood that needed to last through the season had to be rationed carefully. Too generous with fuel early in winter could mean freezing later when supplies ran out. So even the comfort of a roaring fire was often denied, replaced by careful, minimal flames that provided just enough warmth to prevent freezing, but never enough for true comfort. The darkness also affected the economy and productivity of medieval communities. Entire categories of work simply ceased when the sun set. Blacksmiths couldn't see their work. Weavers couldn't manage their looms. Farmers couldn't tend fields. Builders couldn't construct. The darkness imposed an unavoidable pause on economic activity, limiting productivity in ways that modern round-the-clock operations have completely eliminated. This seasonal rhythm meant that winter represented not just physical hardship, but economic stagnation. Communities would prepare frantically during the longer daylight hours of summer and autumn, knowing that winter's extended darkness would reduce them to mere survival mode. The annual cycle of light and dark governed life in ways that went far beyond simple convenience, shaping the entire structure of medieval existence. The darkness also had profound effects on mental health, though medieval people lacked the vocabulary to describe what we now call seasonal affective disorder. The long winter nights, combined with limited light even during short winter days, created conditions that would have triggered depression in many individuals. The medieval response to this wasn't therapy or light boxes, but rather increased religious devotion, communal gathering when possible, and grim acceptance that this was simply how life proceeded. Storytelling became crucial during these long dark hours. With nothing else to occupy time, families would share tales, some entertaining, some educational, many frightening. These stories, told by firelight to captive audiences trapped indoors by darkness, became the primary means of transmitting culture, values, warnings, and history. The oral tradition that preserved so much medieval folklore was born directly from the necessity of filling endless dark hours with something, anything, to occupy minds and distract from discomfort and fear. Children growing up in this environment developed a relationship with darkness that modern children, raised with nightlights and illuminated streets, can barely comprehend. From their earliest memories, darkness meant danger, it meant cold, it meant fear. This wasn't taught through lectures, but absorbed through lived experience, night after night, year after year. By the time medieval children reached adulthood, the fear of night was so deeply ingrained it was simply part of their understanding of reality. The elderly faced particular challenges with medieval darkness. Their failing eyesight made navigation even more difficult. Their reduced tolerance for cold made winter nights especially dangerous. Their diminished hearing meant they couldn't rely as effectively on sound to compensate for lack of sight. Many elderly people essentially became prisoners in their own homes once darkness fell, dependent on younger family members for any needs that arose during nighttime hours. This dependence reinforced family structures and multi-generational living arrangements. An elderly person living alone faced genuine survival challenges that could only be overcome through community and family support. The darkness in this sense enforced social cohesion, making isolation not just lonely but actually dangerous. The absence of light also meant the absence of surveillance and accountability. Actions taken under cover of darkness could be hidden from community observation. This privacy had both positive and negative implications. It allowed for private grief, for intimate moments, for personal prayer without public performance. But it also enabled domestic troubles to remain hidden, allowed harmful behaviours to continue unseen, and created spaces where abuses could occur without witness or intervention. Medieval legal systems recognised this challenge. Many laws and customs specifically addressed nighttime behaviour, acknowledging that darkness created unique opportunities for wrongdoing. Curfew regulations attempted to control who was abroad after dark. Harsh penalties for nighttime crimes reflected the understanding that darkness made criminal activity both more likely and more difficult to prevent or punish. The concept of night watch, common in medieval towns and cities, represented communities' attempts to extend human oversight into the dark hours. These watches were often poorly organised and ineffective, with watchmen falling asleep being easily bribed, or simply lacking the resources to effectively monitor darkened streets. But the existence of night watches demonstrated recognition that darkness created security vulnerabilities requiring dedicated response. Wealthy merchants and nobles could afford to hire private guards for nighttime protection, creating a system where safety correlated directly with economic resources. This inequality meant that darkness was genuinely more dangerous for the poor than for the rich, adding another dimension to the social stratification that characterised medieval society. The architecture of medieval buildings reflected the challenge of darkness. Windows were small, not just for thermal efficiency, but also because glass was expensive, and large openings were security vulnerabilities. These tiny windows meant that even during daylight interior spaces were dim. Once night fell, they became black holes where even candlelight struggled to penetrate the gloom. The layout of medieval homes, often single rooms or simple multi-room structures, was partly practical response to lighting limitations. Illuminating multiple separate rooms was prohibitively expensive and complicated. Better to have everyone in one space, sharing light and heat, accepting the lack of privacy as a reasonable trade-off for efficiency and safety. The darkness also affected hygiene and cleanliness. Detailed cleaning was impossible without adequate light. Spotting dirt, vermin, or damage to structures required visibility that nighttime couldn't provide. This meant that truly thorough cleaning could only happen during daylight hours, and even then, the dim interiors of medieval buildings made cleanliness an ongoing challenge. The cumulative effect of living with such profound darkness shaped medieval psychology in ways that extended far beyond simple fear. It created a worldview where light was synonymous with goodness, knowledge, safety, and divine presence, while darkness represented evil, ignorance, danger, and separation from the divine. This wasn't merely metaphorical thinking, but reflected actual lived experience, where light truly did mean safety and darkness truly did bring danger. Religious architecture and ritual reflected this light-darkness symbolism. Churches were built with careful attention to how light would enter through windows, creating dramatic illumination effects that reinforced theological messages about divine light dispelling spiritual darkness. Candlelight processions and vigils held special significance, representing human attempts to carry light into darkness, to push back the night through sacred flame. The miracle of sunrise, which modern people barely notice, was genuinely celebrated in medieval culture. Morning prayers weren't just routine religious obligation, but heartfelt thanksgiving for having survived another night, for the return of a light and safety, for another day of life granted against the odds. This gratitude gave daily life a intensity and awareness that constant modern comfort has largely eliminated. Darkness might have stolen sight, but it seemed to amplify every other sense, particularly hearing. In the absolute quiet of medieval nights, sounds carried with startling clarity, and every noise, from the mundane to the mysterious, could send imagination spiralling into fear. The medieval soundscape after dark was unlike anything experienced in the modern world. No traffic hum provided background white noise, no distant sirens or airplane engines rumbled overhead, no neighbours' televisions or music filtered through walls. Instead, there was a quality of silence so profound that even the smallest sound could seem thunderous, and medieval nights were never truly silent. The wind was perhaps the most constant companion of darkness, moaning through trees, whistling around corners, rattling shutters and doors. On calm nights, it might whisper gently, almost soothingly. But when storms approached or winter winds picked up, that same wind could howl like something alive, something angry, something trying desperately to get inside. Wood buildings creaked and groaned under wind pressure, creating sounds that could easily be mistaken for footsteps or someone attempting to force entry. Animals provided another layer to the night's symphony. Domesticated creatures, cows, pigs, chickens, horses, would shift in their pens, making rustling, snorting, and occasional louder noises that might signal simple restlessness or could indicate distress at something unseen. Families learned to distinguish normal animal sounds from those suggesting danger, though on edge-of-sleep nights, this distinction wasn't always easy to maintain. Wild animals brought more concerning sounds. Wolves, still common across much of medieval Europe, would howl in the distance, their eerie calls carrying for miles across the dark countryside. To modern ears, wolf howls might seem almost romantic, the call of the wild. To medieval ears, they were direct threats, reminders that predators were active, hunting, and not particularly concerned about the difference between wild prey and domesticated livestock, or, in desperate times, vulnerable humans. Owls would hoot from the forests, their calls considered omens by many medieval people. Bears, still present in some regions, might be heard crashing through underbrush. Foxes produce sounds remarkably similar to human screams, particularly during mating season, a phenomenon that terrified many who heard it without understanding its source. Even smaller creatures, rats scurrying through thatched roofs, bats squeaking overhead, insects chirping or buzzing, contributed to the nighttime cacophony. But perhaps the most unsettling sounds were those that couldn't be easily identified. A distant thud, a scraping noise with no apparent source, footsteps that seemed to circle a building before fading away, voices carried on the wind from impossible distances. Medieval people, lacking scientific explanations for acoustic phenomena, often interpreted these mysterious sounds through the lens of their beliefs and fears. That unexplained noise couldn't possibly be wind-shifted debris, or an animal they'd failed to recognise. It had to be something else, something supernatural, something dangerous. Stories abounded of night travellers who heard their names called from the darkness, only to find no one when they investigated. Of knocking at doors that, when opened, revealed empty thresholds. Of music and laughter echoing from the forest where no celebration was taking place. Religious authorities and folklore both reinforced the interpretation of strange sounds as demonic or spiritual activity. Demons, according to church teachings, could mimic human voices to lure the faithful into danger. Spirits of the deceased might wander at night, unable to rest. Fairies and other supernatural beings delighted in misleading travellers with false sounds. The fear of nocturnal sounds was so significant that many medieval communities developed specific rules about responding to noises after dark. If someone heard knocking after sunset, they might be advised to pray before answering, or to wait until the knock repeated 3 times, as certain entities supposedly couldn't maintain such persistence. If voices were heard calling from outside, families might respond verbally without opening doors, testing whether the caller would answer appropriately or dissolve into suspicious silence. Children were warned never to respond to their names being called at night, unless they could absolutely verify the source. This wasn't merely superstitious caution, it was practical safety advice, in an era when criminals and ill-intentioned individuals operated freely after dark, sometimes using familiar voices or pretended distress to lure victims from their homes. The darkness might hide visual threats, but it couldn't muffle sounds, and so the ears became the primary warning system, the first line of defence against dangers both natural and supernatural. Medieval people developed a kind of acoustic literacy, learning to read the night through its sounds, to distinguish between the normal and the alarming, between the safe and the threatening. It was a skill learned through necessity, passed from parent to child, refined through years of listening, interpreting, surviving. Yet even the most experienced listeners could never be entirely certain. The night kept its secrets well, and sounds without the confirmation of sight remained forever ambiguous, forever concerning, forever capable of triggering that ancient instinctive fear of the unknown. And so families would lie in their beds in the darkness listening to the symphony of night sounds, interpreting and reinterpreting each noise, seeking reassurance that everything was normal, everything was safe, nothing terrible was approaching through the dark. Sometimes they found that reassurance, sometimes they didn't. The acoustic environment of medieval nights also included human-made sounds that modern people rarely experience. The night watch, where one existed, would call out the hours, shouting, "All is well," or announcing the time. These calls served dual purposes, reassuring citizens that someone was maintaining vigilance, while also potentially scaring away those with ill intent, by demonstrating that the darkness wasn't entirely unwatched. Church bells marked canonical hours, ringing at specific times throughout the night for midnight prayers, matins, and other religious observances. These bells provided temporal orientation in the timeless darkness, dividing the long night into manageable segments. Their sound also carried religious significance, blessed bronze ringing out to sanctify the darkness, to remind evil forces that sacred vigilance continued even when most humans slept. The sound of rain on thatched roofs created its own ambience, sometimes soothing, sometimes ominous depending on the intensity. A gentle rain might lull families towards sleep. A violent storm battering the roof and walls would keep everyone awake, worried about leaks, structural damage, or flooding. Thunder and lightning added terrifying punctuation to stormy nights, with each crash and flash sending hearts racing. Snow created a peculiar acoustic phenomenon, muffling all sounds and creating an eerie silence that was both peaceful and unnerving. A snow-covered landscape absorbed sounds so effectively that even nearby noises became difficult to hear. This meant that threats could approach more closely before being detected, adding another layer of vulnerability to winter nights. Ice storms brought their own sounds, the cracking of tree branches breaking under accumulated weight, the crash as they fell to the ground, the tinkling of ice particles striking structures. These sounds could continue throughout the night, creating a constant reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human shelters against it. The sounds of sickness were another nighttime constant. Before modern medicine, when illness struck a household member, their suffering often intensified at night. Coughing, moaning, laboured breathing. These sounds of human distress filled dark hours, troubling not just the sick person, but everyone trying to sleep while listening to their loved one's pain. These sounds of illness carried particular weight because they might herald death. As someone's condition worsened, as breathing became more laboured or irregular, family members listening in the darkness would wonder if each breath might be the last. The long stretches between breaths could seem eternal, with listeners waiting tensely to hear if another breath would come or if silence would signal the end. Childbirth sounds were similarly significant. Women in labour would cry out through the night as midwives worked to deliver babies. These sounds of effort, pain, and eventually, hopefully, relief signalled one of life's most critical moments occurring under the cover of darkness. The entire household would remain awake, listening, praying, hoping for the sounds that would indicate successful delivery and healthy mother and child. The sounds of violence, when they occurred, were particularly traumatic. Fights between family members, confrontations with intruders, attacks by animals on livestock, all these created sounds that spread terror through dark communities. Screams, breaking objects, scuffling, and then often the most ominous sound of all, sudden silence, indicating something terrible had concluded. Fire was another sound that struck fear. The crackle and roar of flames consuming buildings, the shouts of alarm, the panic as communities rallied to fight blazes in the darkness, these sounds announced catastrophe. Fire spreading through tightly packed medieval settlements could destroy entire neighbourhoods, and nighttime fires were particularly dangerous because detection was delayed by darkness. The sounds of animals in distress at night signalled various threats. Chickens squawking might mean a fox had entered the coop. Cattle lowing frantically could indicate wolves or thieves. Horses whinnying and stamping suggested something alarming them. Each of these sounds would bring adults bolt upright from sleep, grabbing whatever weapons or tools were available, rushing out into the darkness to defend their livelihood despite the personal danger such nighttime intervention involved. The absence of expected sounds could be as concerning as strange noises. If the regular night watchman failed to call out the hours, something might have happened to him. If livestock that usually made occasional sounds through the night went completely silent, it might indicate they'd been taken or killed. Silence, in some contexts, signalled danger as clearly as alarming noises. Medieval people developed sophisticated mental catalogues of normal nighttime sounds versus those requiring investigation or defensive response. This knowledge was survival skill, passed down through careful instruction and painful experience. Making the wrong call about a sound, investigating when one should barricade inside, or ignoring when one should respond could have fatal consequences. The psychological toll of constant nighttime auditory vigilance was substantial. Sleep, when it came, was light and easily interrupted. The mind remained partially alert even during rest, monitoring the acoustic environment for threats. This chronic low-level stress, maintained night after night for entire lifetimes, contributed to the generally lower life expectancies and higher rates of anxiety-related ailments that characterized medieval populations. Lullabies and evening songs served important functions in this acoustic landscape. Parents would sing to children not just for comfort, but to create familiar, controlled sounds that could mask or contextualize the frightening noises of the night. The human voice, particularly in song or prayer, became an assertion of human presence against the darkness. a way of claiming acoustic territory that night seemed determined to steal. Silence as a defensive strategy was also practiced. When truly alarming sounds were heard, families might go completely quiet, extinguishing lights, ceasing all activity, hoping that whatever was outside would pass without noticing their presence. In these moments, even breathing would be controlled, made as quiet as possible, with everyone frozen in place waiting for the danger to move on. The relief that came with dawn wasn't just about returning light, but also about the changing soundscape. As morning birds began singing, as domestic animals stirred and called out normally, as human activities resumed creating familiar sounds, the threatening acoustic environment of night gave way to the comfortable, comprehensible sounds of day. This daily transition from fear to relief, played out through sound as much as light, marked the rhythm of medieval existence in ways that modern people, with their 24-hour sound environments of traffic and machinery, can barely imagine. Beyond the relative safety of village walls and shuttered homes, the medieval night belonged to creatures that moved with confidence through the darkness, creatures perfectly adapted to hunt when humans were at their most vulnerable. Wolves were perhaps the most feared of these nocturnal predators, animals that loomed large in both the reality and mythology of medieval Europe. Unlike the largely symbolic threat they pose in modern wilderness areas, medieval wolves were genuine, persistent dangers to both livestock and humans. These weren't the cautious, human-avoiding wolves of today, pushed to the margins of civilization and taught through generations to fear mankind. Medieval wolves were bolder, accustomed to human presence, hungry in ways that made them willing to take risks that modern wolves typically avoid. During harsh winters, when natural prey grew scarce, wolves would venture right into villages, driven by desperation to feed. A wolf pack could devastate a community's livestock in a single night, taking sheep, goats, pigs, even cattle if the opportunity presented. These animals represented not just financial loss, but potential starvation for families depending on them for survival. The sound of panicked livestock in the middle of the night, combined with the growls and howls of hunting wolves, was enough to freeze the blood of any medieval farmer listening helplessly from inside their home. But the fear went deeper than economic concern. Wolves would, on occasion, approach humans. Children were particularly vulnerable, small enough to be seen as prey, often tasked with outdoor chores that might take them near the forest edges at dawn or dusk. Women travelling alone, elderly individuals, anyone isolated and defenceless could become targets. Historical records document numerous cases of wolf encounters, particularly during the winter months when hunger drove the animals to extraordinary boldness. The medieval response to wolf threats was communal and constant. Villages organised hunting parties to track down and eliminate wolf packs near settlements. Bounties were offered for wolf pelts. Traps were set. Livestock were guarded with particular vigilance during the night, with farmers sometimes sleeping in barns rather than leaving animals unprotected. Yet despite these efforts, wolves remained a persistent presence, a reminder that humans were not the only predators in the medieval landscape. Bears, though less common and generally less aggressive toward humans than wolves, posed their own significant threats. A bear breaking into a food storage area could destroy months of carefully preserved supplies. An unexpected encounter with a bear in the forest could prove extremely dangerous. Even the smaller predators, foxes, wildcats, badgers, could pose problems, raiding chicken coops, spreading disease, or simply adding to the general sense of danger that nighttime represented. Wild boars were particularly dangerous, not primarily as predators, but as aggressive territorial animals with sharp tusks and remarkable strength. A boar encountered unexpectedly in the dark was a serious threat, capable of causing severe wounds. Hunters who tracked boars learned to treat them with immense respect, recognizing that these animals would fight vigorously when cornered or surprised. Beyond mammalian predators, the night sky held its own hunters. Owls, bats, and nightjars filled the air, their flights silent and sudden, occasionally startling travellers. While these creatures posed little actual danger to humans, their nocturnal nature and often eerie appearance or sounds contributed to the general atmosphere of strangeness that characterized medieval nights. Owls, in particular, were viewed with suspicion and often associated with dark omens in folklore. Their ability to fly silently, their piercing calls, and their habit of hunting in graveyards and other liminal spaces created associations with death and the supernatural. Seeing an owl, especially one that seemed to deliberately follow or observe a person, was considered a very bad sign. The presence of these wild hunters did more than create physical danger. It reinforced a fundamental medieval understanding that the night belonged to nature, not to humanity. During the day, humans could assert control over their environment, clearing land, building structures, moving with confidence through a landscape they'd shaped to their needs. But when darkness fell, that control dissolved. Nature reasserted its dominion. The creatures perfectly adapted to darkness moved freely while humans huddled in their fragile shelters, hoping that walls and doors would prove sufficient barriers against the wild. This nightly surrender of territory had psychological implications that echoed through medieval culture. Humans were not, the darkness reminded them every night, the undisputed masters of creation. They were vulnerable, capable of becoming prey, dependent on barriers and fire and luck to survive the hours when other creatures hunted. The wilderness pressed close against every medieval settlement, a constant presence that could never be entirely subdued or controlled. Travellers forced to journey at night understood they were entering the domain of these predators. Those with resources might hire armed escorts or travel in groups large enough to deter animal encounters. Torches would be carried not just for light but for the protection fire offered. Most animals would avoid flames. Noise might be made deliberately, singing, talking loudly, banging sticks, to warn creatures away rather than surprising them. Yet even with precautions, night travel remained extraordinarily dangerous. Stories circulated constantly of travellers who never reached their destinations, whose remains might be discovered days or weeks later, often with evidence of animal involvement. Whether these individuals were approached by animals, fell victim to human criminals, or simply succumbed to exposure and accident often remained unclear. But the outcome was the same. The night had claimed another life. The threat of wild predators shaped medieval behaviour in countless ways. Activities were planned around daylight hours. Journeys were timed to avoid nighttime travel. Settlements were located with defensive considerations in mind, avoiding areas too close to dense forests or known animal territories. The architecture of homes reflected this concern, with sturdy doors and shuttered windows that could be secured against intrusion. Children absorbed these lessons early, learning that darkness meant danger, that the forest at night was absolutely forbidden, that strange sounds required alertness and caution. These weren't abstract rules, but practical survival strategies, wisdom earned through generations of coexistence with predators that saw humans as potential prey. The wild hunters of medieval nights have largely disappeared from modern European landscapes. Wolves have been eliminated from most areas. Bears are rare. Even the smaller predators exist in reduced numbers, pushed back by expanding human development. Modern people can walk through the night with little fear of animal encounters, a luxury medieval people could never afford. But the legacy of those fears remains, embedded in fairy tales and folklore, in stories of big bad wolves and bears in the woods, cautionary tales that once held literal life-or-death truth. When medieval people feared the night, they weren't being irrational. They were responding to a reality where the darkness genuinely did bring predators, where the sounds in the shadows might belong to creatures viewing humans as food, where survival required constant vigilance and a healthy respect for the fact that in the contest between human and wolf in the darkness, the odds weren't nearly as favourable as one might hope. The seasonal patterns of predator behaviour added another layer of complexity. Spring meant hungry predators emerging from winter, desperate for food. Summer brought easier hunting conditions for animals, making them potentially less interested in risky human encounters. Autumn saw predators building reserves for winter, becoming more aggressive in their hunting, and winter, the most dangerous season, brought starvation that made predators willing to take extraordinary risks, including approaching human settlements. Medieval people learned to read these patterns, adjusting their caution levels with the seasons. Winter nights required even more vigilance than summer ones. Spring and autumn, the transitional seasons, brought unpredictability. The natural calendar governed fear in ways that recognised genuine, fluctuating risk, rather than constant, unchanging terror. Different regions faced different predator threats. Northern forests held wolves and bears in abundance. Southern regions dealt with different challenges. Coastal areas had fewer large land predators, but faced other dangers from the sea. The specific nature of nighttime fear varied by geography, but the underlying reality remained constant. The night brought dangers that humans ignored at their peril. The practice of keeping dogs for protection was universal in medieval communities. Dogs could hear and smell approaching threats long before humans detected them. Their barking served as early warning system, alerting families to dangers in the darkness. A good dog was valued not just for its utility during the day, but for its role as nighttime sentinel, sleeping lightly and ready to sound alarm at any unusual presence. Livestock guardian dogs, large breeds specifically developed to protect flocks and herds, represented serious investments. These dogs would stay with their charges through the night, positioned between them and the darkness, ready to confront any predator attempting to approach. The relationship between humans and these guardian dogs was one of mutual dependence, with both species recognizing their better chances of survival through cooperation. The medieval understanding of predator behavior, while lacking modern scientific terminology, was remarkably sophisticated through practical observation. People knew which animals hunted in packs versus alone. They understood seasonal migration patterns. They recognized that injured or diseased animals were often more dangerous because they couldn't hunt normal prey effectively and might turn to easier targets. This knowledge was taught systematically to children as essential education, equal in importance to learning farming techniques or religious teachings. Understanding how to avoid, deter, or if necessary confront predators was survival skill that every person needed to possess. Those who failed to learn these lessons, who underestimated nighttime dangers, or overestimated their own abilities, often paid with their lives, becoming cautionary examples that reinforced the lessons for the next generation. The relationship between humans and predators in medieval times was more complex than simple fear or simple hunting. There was recognition that predators played roles in the ecosystem, controlling populations of crop-damaging animals like deer and rabbits. But this pragmatic appreciation existed alongside genuine terror of the threats these animals posed. The modern concept of wildlife conservation would have seemed absurd to medieval people. Predators were problems to be eliminated when possible, tolerated when necessary, and feared at all times. The idea of deliberately protecting predator populations would have struck medieval communities as suicidal insanity. Their relationship with these animals was purely adversarial, shaped by bitter experience and countless losses. Yet there was also respect, grudging acknowledgement that these creatures were survivors, perfectly suited to their ecological niche, worthy adversaries in the ongoing struggle for territory and resources. The wolf who evaded traps and continued raiding livestock earned a certain fearful admiration. The bear that proved uncatchable became legendary. These animals were enemies but formidable ones, commanding respect even while being hunted. The folklore that grew around predators reflected this complex relationship. Werewolf legends, shapeshifters, and cursed humans transforming into beasts spoke to deep anxieties about the thin line between human and animal, about the possibility of regression into predatory violence. These stories warned about losing humanity's distinguishing characteristics, moral reasoning and self-control, and becoming mere beasts driven by appetite. Similarly, stories of noble wolves or magical bears that helped heroes reflected wishful thinking about befriending these powerful creatures, turning potential enemies into allies. These fantasies acknowledged predators' strength and capabilities, while imagining scenarios where that power served human interest rather than threatening them. The eternal presence of predators in the darkness, night after night, generation after generation, shaped medieval psychology in profound ways. Humans were not safe. Civilization was fragile. The wild was always waiting, always ready to reclaim territory and remind humanity of its vulnerability. This awareness prevented complacency, maintaining vigilance that saved lives even as it created stress and fear. When morning came and predators retreated to their dens and lairs, medieval people could move with greater confidence, though never complete safety. But that daily reprieve only lasted until sunset, when the cycle would begin again. The nighttime predators would emerge, and humans would retreat, and the ancient contest between species would continue as it had for millennia, and would continue for millennia more. If wild animals represented one category of nighttime threat, human predators represented another, perhaps even more disturbing in their calculated cruelty. Medieval nights provided perfect cover for those with ill intent, and the darkness that hindered honest folk aided criminals splendidly in their work. Bandits, thieves, and violent individuals operated with relative freedom once the sun set, knowing that their chances of being caught, identified, or stopped decreased dramatically in the absence of light. The medieval justice system, such as it was, had limited reach and even more limited effectiveness after dark. There were no organised police forces, no street patrols with lanterns, no swift response to cries for help. In rural areas, the nearest representative of authority might be miles away, and even if summoned, would be unlikely to travel at night to investigate incidents. In cities and larger towns, night watches existed but were often understaffed, poorly trained, and easily avoided by those who knew the streets. This created an environment where unlawful activity flourished in the darkness. Thieves could break into homes, shops, or storage buildings with minimal risk of immediate discovery. The absence of lighting meant no witnesses could identify perpetrators. The noise of forced entry might go unheard or be dismissed as ordinary nighttime sounds by neighbours reluctant to investigate. By the time theft was discovered in the morning, the criminals would be long gone, their stolen goods already sold or hidden. Bandits found the roads at night particularly profitable. Travellers who had no choice but to journey after dark made tempting targets, carrying money, goods, and supplies. Isolated on dark roads, often alone or in small groups, these travellers had little defence against ambush. Bandits could lurk in roadside shadows, observing approaching torchlight from safety, timing their attacks for maximum advantage. The darkness that helped travellers find their way also announced their presence to anyone watching. Violence was an ever-present possibility during these encounters. While some criminals simply wanted valuables and would flee once obtaining them, others were more dangerous, willing to harm those who resisted or to eliminate witnesses. Medieval roads became notorious for disappearances, travellers who set out and were never heard from again. Sometimes remains would be discovered eventually, often they wouldn't, leaving families to wonder whether their loved one had fallen victim to criminals, animals, accidents, or simply gotten lost in the darkness. Cities, despite having larger populations and theoretically more oversight, had their own nocturnal problems with lawlessness. Dark alleys and narrow streets created countless opportunities for robbery and assault. Individuals leaving taverns made easy targets. Those working at night faced constant danger from violent clients or opportunistic criminals. Even seemingly safe neighbourhoods could harbour threats, with criminals learning to recognise wealthy homes and planning burglaries during the deepest part of night when residents slept most soundly. Arson was another nighttime activity that communities particularly feared. A fire started in the darkness could spread rapidly through wooden structures before anyone noticed, potentially destroying entire neighbourhoods. Some fires were accidental, caused by knocked-over candles or poorly maintained hearths, but others were deliberately set by arsonists seeking revenge, covering evidence of other offences, or simply enjoying the chaos and destruction. In the darkness, identifying an arsonist was nearly impossible, and by the time the flames were visible, the culprit had vanished into the night. The threat of violence wasn't limited to strangers and criminals. Domestic disputes could escalate dangerously in the privacy of nighttime, when neighbours couldn't see what was happening and were reluctant to intervene even if they heard concerning sounds. The darkness provided cover for family troubles, hidden tragedies that occurred behind closed doors while the community slept. Medieval law offered limited protection to victims of domestic harm, and the nighttime isolation made seeking help even more difficult. Women faced particular vulnerabilities during the night. Walking alone after dark, even short distances, was considered extremely dangerous and socially inappropriate. The risk of assault was significant enough that respectable women simply didn't venture outside after sunset, unless absolutely necessary, and accompanied by male protectors. This restriction limited women's freedom substantially, reinforcing social hierarchies through the practical mechanism of physical safety concerns. Communities attempted various strategies to combat nighttime lawlessness. Curfew laws were common, requiring all residents to be indoors after a certain hour, with violations punishable by fine or imprisonment. These curfews served dual purposes, reducing opportunities for wrongdoing and making it easier to identify people who were outside with potentially ill intent. If someone was encountered on the streets after curfew, they immediately fell under suspicion, Wealthy individuals and merchants might hire private guards to protect their property at night, creating small islands of security in otherwise vulnerable areas. Some neighbourhoods organised voluntary watch systems with residents taking turns patrolling, or at least remaining alert for suspicious activity. These efforts had limited effectiveness, but provided some measure of deterrence. The existence of nighttime lawlessness reinforced class divisions in medieval society. Wealthy individuals could afford protection, secure housing, and the option to simply avoid situations that might require nighttime travel. Poor people had none of these advantages. They lived in less secure housing, couldn't afford guards, and sometimes had no choice but to travel or work at night despite the risks. The darkness, in this sense, was more dangerous for some than for others, with vulnerability correlating closely to social and economic status. The fear of human predators in the darkness wasn't paranoia, it was an acknowledgement of reality. Medieval communities regularly experienced nighttime wrongdoing. Everyone knew someone who had been robbed, assaulted, or worse. The stories circulated constantly, reminders that the darkness brought not just supernatural terrors, but very tangible, very human threats. In some ways, these human predators were more frightening than wild animals. Animals at least operated on instinct, seeking food or defending territory. Human criminals acted with intention, with malice, with a capacity for cruelty that animals couldn't match. They could plan, deceive, wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike. They understood human vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly. And unlike animals that might be trapped or driven away, human criminals could blend back into the community during daylight, hiding in plain sight, waiting for darkness to return so they could operate again. The knowledge that one's neighbours might include such individuals added another layer of unease to medieval nights. The darkness didn't just hide strangers, it hid anyone and everyone, transforming the familiar into the potentially threatening. That person glimpsed in shadows. Was it a neighbour on legitimate business, or someone with darker purposes? That sound of footsteps outside, were they merely passing by, or circling, looking for an opportunity? Medieval people couldn't know, and that uncertainty, that inability to trust their own senses in the darkness, made every night an exercise in anxiety. Criminal organisations, while not as structured as modern gangs, did exist in medieval cities. Groups of thieves would coordinate activities, sharing information about targets, dividing territories, and sometimes providing protection to each other when authorities attempted intervention. These networks made urban nighttime crime particularly difficult to combat, as criminals had support systems and escape routes planned in advance. The punishment for those caught committing nighttime offences was often severe, reflecting society's recognition of the particular harm caused by exploiting darkness for wrongdoing. Being caught stealing at night might result in harsher penalties than daytime theft. Violence committed under cover of darkness carried additional stigma and punishment. This harsh response aimed to deter nighttime lawlessness through fear of consequences, though its actual effectiveness was limited. Pirates and coastal raiders added another dimension to nighttime human threats in areas near water. These attackers would approach under cover of darkness, raid coastal settlements, and disappear before effective resistance could be organised. Coastal communities lived with constant awareness that any night might bring raiders from the sea, adding maritime dangers to the terrestrial threats already keeping them awake. Highway robbery became so associated with nighttime that the phrase highwayman became synonymous with romantic criminal figures in later folklore. But there was nothing romantic about the reality of being stopped on a dark road by armed individuals demanding valuables. These encounters were terrifying, potentially lethal experiences that left lasting trauma even when victims survived physically unharmed. The psychological impact of nighttime crime extended beyond direct victims. Entire communities lived with anxiety, knowing that any night might bring criminals, that anyone could become a target, that the darkness provided cover for acts that daylight social structures prevented. This ambient fear shaped behaviour, restricted freedom, and contributed to the overall sense that nighttime was dangerous, in ways that went beyond natural or supernatural threats. Some individuals, ironically, found opportunity in nighttime chaos. Those willing to offer protection, whether legitimate guardians or protection racketeers, could profit from others' fears. The line between protector and extortionist was sometimes blurry, with the same individuals offering security while also creating the threats that made their services necessary. The correlation between poverty and nighttime crime created social tensions. Wealthy citizens blamed the poor for criminal activity, advocating harsh measures and increased surveillance. The poor, meanwhile, pointed out that desperation drove nighttime theft, that if society provided adequate daytime opportunities for survival, fewer people would resort to criminal activity after dark. These class tensions played out through debates about nighttime security, with different groups having different priorities and perspectives. Women working as prostitutes represented a particularly vulnerable population, often forced to operate at night when respectability demanded other women remain indoors. These workers faced violence from clients, harassment from authorities, and danger from other criminals, all while trying to earn survival through activities society simultaneously depended upon and condemned. Their stories, rarely recorded in official histories, represented some of the most tragic dimensions of medieval nighttime reality. The absence of street lighting in most medieval communities meant that even well-intentioned people moving at night could be mistaken for threats. Legitimate travellers might be attacked by frightened residents who assumed anyone abroad after dark had ill intentions. Night watchmen might confront innocent individuals, leading to misunderstandings that sometimes escalated into violence. The darkness didn't just enable actual crimes, it created conditions where fear of crime generated its own harmful consequences. Smuggling operations naturally gravitated toward nighttime, using darkness to move contraband past authorities. This created an economic underworld that operated parallel to legitimate daytime commerce, with its own networks, customs, and enforcement mechanisms. Those involved in smuggling lived double lives, respectable merchants by day, lawbreakers by night, their dual existence dependent on darkness to maintain separation between their legitimate and illicit activities. The medieval church's response to nighttime crime included both practical and spiritual elements. Priests preached against theft and violence, threatening divine punishment. Churches offered sanctuary to those fleeing danger. Religious authorities worked with secular powers to establish laws and customs designed to reduce nighttime lawlessness. Yet despite these efforts, the fundamental conditions that enabled crime, poverty, darkness, limited law enforcement, remained largely unchanged throughout the medieval period. When dawn finally broke and daylight returned, bringing visibility and relative safety, there was genuine relief. The night's threats, both human and otherwise, receded. The community could emerge from behind barred doors, assess whether everyone had survived unscathed, and begin the day's activities with the comforting knowledge that they had, once again, made it through the darkness intact. But evening would come again, inevitably, and with it would return all the dangers, both natural and man-made, that made medieval people so genuinely, rationally terrified of the night. Physical threats from animals and criminals were frightening enough, but medieval people believed the night held dangers even more terrible. Supernatural entities that emerged when darkness fell, seeking to harm, deceive, or claim human souls. This wasn't merely folklore or entertaining stories told around fires. For medieval people, the supernatural was absolutely real, as concrete and undeniable as the sun rising each morning, and nighttime was understood as the domain where these forces operated most freely. The medieval Christian church taught extensively about demons, fallen angels who had rebelled against the divine and now sought to corrupt and destroy humanity. These weren't abstract theological concepts, but active, present dangers that required constant vigilance. According to church doctrine, demons could appear in various forms, tempting people into wrongdoing, causing physical harm, possessing vulnerable individuals, or simply creating fear and chaos. And while demons could theoretically operate at any time, night was considered their preferred hunting hour. Darkness was theologically significant in medieval Christianity, symbolically associated with opposition to the divine, with wrongdoing, and with separation from sacred light. When the sun set, removing physical light from the world, the metaphorical spiritual illumination that protected humanity from demonic influence was understood to weaken as well. Demons grew bolder, their power increased, their ability to interact with the mortal world expanded. The night literally belonged to forces of opposition in ways that daylight hours did not. This belief had practical implications for how people behaved after dark. Evening prayers took on special importance, seeking divine protection through the vulnerable hours ahead. Crucifixes, holy medals, blessed objects, and protective charms were kept close, physical reminders of spiritual armour against demonic threats. Many homes had blessed water or salt that could be used to ward off harmful influences. Scripture passages might be recited when strange sounds were heard or unusual phenomena occurred. Children were baptised as quickly as possible after birth, in part because the unbaptised were considered especially vulnerable to demonic influence. The night held particular danger for unbaptised infants, and stories circulated of children taken by dark entities before they could receive the sacrament's protection. Parents would take extraordinary precautions, keeping baptism candles burning, maintaining prayer vigils, never leaving newborns unattended after dark until they could be brought to the church. Beyond demons, medieval folklore teemed with other supernatural beings that emerged at night. The specific creatures varied by region and culture, but nearly every medieval community had traditions about nocturnal spirits, entities, or monsters that posed various threats to unwary humans. Ghosts of the deceased were believed to walk at night, unable to rest for various reasons. Unfinished business, improper burial, lives ended through violence or wrongdoing. Some ghosts were merely sorrowful, wandering without threatening the living. Others were actively malevolent, seeking revenge or attempting to drag living souls into death alongside them. Seeing a ghost was considered an extremely bad omen, often predicting misfortune or disaster. Encountering one required specific responses, prayers, signs of the cross, backing away without turning one's back, which were taught as essential knowledge for surviving such meetings. Fairies, though often portrayed charmingly in modern retellings, were feared in medieval folklore. These beings were tricksters at best, dangerous at worst, capable of leading travellers astray, taking children, cursing those who offended them, or causing crops and livestock to fail. Fairy encounters were most likely at night, particularly during certain times of year, or in specific locations known to be fairy territory. Crossroads, ancient burial mounds, circles of mushrooms, certain groves or streams, all were considered dangerous to approach after dark. Witches, according to medieval belief, conducted their most powerful and dangerous magic at night. They might fly through the darkness to attend gatherings, where they worshipped dark powers and plotted against their communities. They could transform into animals, cast curses from a distance, brew potions with terrible effects, or summon demons to do their bidding. The fear of witchcraft was profound and widespread, leading to tragic persecution that would intensify in later medieval and early modern periods. Vampires, werewolves, and other shape-shifting creatures appeared in various forms across medieval folklore, beings that transformed at night into monstrous versions of themselves, consuming life force, spreading disease, or committing acts impossible in their daylight forms. While the specific legends varied, the core theme remained consistent: nighttime transformation into something dangerous, something no longer fully human, something to be feared and avoided at all costs. Dragons, though more commonly associated with remote mountain lairs, were also considered nocturnal hunters in many traditions. A dragon flying overhead in the darkness, breathing fire and seeking prey, represented an apocalyptic-level threat that fortunately was more legendary than commonly encountered. But the possibility existed in the medieval imagination, adding yet another layer to the catalogue of nighttime terrors. The great adversary himself was believed to be most active at night, personally appearing to tempt particularly vulnerable or valuable souls. Stories abounded of individuals who encountered a strange traveller on a dark road, only to realise through some revealing detail, cloven hooves, burning eyes, a sulphurous smell, that they were speaking with the ultimate source of evil. These encounters never ended well for the human involved unless they possessed exceptional faith and could call upon divine protection. What made these supernatural threats particularly terrifying was their fundamental unknowability. A wolf could be understood, its behaviour predicted, its weaknesses exploited. Human criminals operated with comprehensible motives and could be confronted or escaped using physical means. But demons, ghosts, fairies, witches, these entities existed outside normal natural laws. They could appear and disappear, pass through walls, cause harm without physical contact, deceive the senses, and target victims in ways no physical barrier could prevent. The medieval understanding of these supernatural threats was remarkably sophisticated in its own framework. There were hierarchies of demons, specific vulnerabilities and strengths for different entities, proper protective measures for various situations, and an extensive body of knowledge about how to recognise, avoid, or counter supernatural dangers. This knowledge was passed down through church teachings, folklore, and practical experience, creating a complex system of beliefs that governed nighttime behaviour. Skepticism about supernatural phenomena existed even in medieval times. Not everyone believed every story, or interpreted every strange occurrence as demonic activity. However, outright disbelief was rare and potentially dangerous, both spiritually and socially. Denying the existence of demons and oppositional spirits could be viewed as heresy, implying doubt about core church teachings. And given that unexplained phenomena did regularly occur, strange sounds, mysterious lights, sudden illnesses, unusual animal behaviour, having a framework for understanding these events through supernatural explanation provided psychological comfort even if it also generated fear. The fear of supernatural nighttime threats influenced architecture, settlement patterns, daily routines, and social structures throughout medieval society. Homes were built with protective elements, symbols carved into beams, strategic placement of windows, threshold charms. Communities were located near churches, whose consecrated ground offered protection. Activities were scheduled to avoid night time as much as possible, and when night came, everyone understood that they were entering a time when the normal rules of reality might not fully apply, when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural grew thin and permeable. Morning brought relief not just from darkness, but from this spiritual danger. Daylight was associated with divine presence, with sacred protective light driving back the forces of opposition. Demons retreated, ghosts faded, dangerous supernatural beings returned to their hidden realms. The world became comprehensible and manageable again. Humanity, for the daylight hours, could operate with confidence that the physical laws of nature would hold steady, that threats would be tangible and understandable rather than mysterious and supernatural. But that relief was temporary. Evening would come again, as it always did, and with it would return the darkness and all the supernatural dangers medieval people believed waited there, patient and eternal, ready to prey upon any soul foolish or unfortunate enough to be caught outside the fragile protections of faith, prayer, and blessed ground. The cycle continued, night after night, year after year, generation after generation, with each sunset bringing renewed fear, and each sunrise bringing grateful thanksgiving for having survived another journey through the realm where dark forces walked. The intersection of these supernatural beliefs with the practical realities of medieval life created a complex psychological landscape. People had to navigate both physical and spiritual dangers simultaneously. A sound in the night might be a wolf, which required one response, or a demon, which required an entirely different approach. This dual framework meant medieval people were constantly evaluating threats on multiple levels, assessing both natural and supernatural possibilities. This worldview, while perhaps seeming strange to modern secular perspectives, provided medieval people with comprehensive explanatory models for their experiences. When bad things happened, when illnesses struck, when crops failed, when accidents occurred, the supernatural framework offered explanations and, importantly, responses. Prayers could be said, protective rituals performed, the church could intervene. This sense of agency, even against supernatural threats, was psychologically important for maintaining hope and resilience in a dangerous world. The communal nature of these beliefs also reinforced social bonds. Shared understanding of supernatural threats created common cause, united communities in mutual protection, and provided frameworks for collective action. When a community believed together, prayed together, and protected itself together against dark forces, those shared practices strengthened social cohesion in ways that benefited the community beyond just supernatural protection. Children growing up in this worldview absorbed these beliefs as naturally as they learned language or social customs. The supernatural wasn't something they had to be convinced of, it was simply how the world worked. This early enculturation meant that by adulthood, these beliefs were deeply integrated into worldview and behaviour, shaping responses to nighttime in profound and automatic ways that didn't require conscious deliberation. The medieval church's role in managing supernatural fears was significant. Priests served as intermediaries between human and divine, capable of blessing objects, consecrating spaces, performing exorcisms, and providing spiritual counsel. This gave the church substantial power and influence, as people depended on ecclesiastical authority for protection against supernatural dangers. The church's teachings about demons and protective practices weren't just religious instruction, but practical guidance for navigating a world understood to be filled with spiritual threats. Yet the church's approach to supernatural beliefs was complex and sometimes contradictory. Official theology about demons and angels existed alongside folk beliefs that the church sometimes tolerated, sometimes condemned, and sometimes incorporated into Christian practice. This created a layered system where official church teachings interacted with regional folk traditions, producing diverse local variants of supernatural belief within the broader Christian framework. The economic dimensions of supernatural fear shouldn't be overlooked. Protective objects, blessed candles, holy water, religious medals represented a market that served both spiritual and commercial interests. Those who could provide supernatural protection, whether priests, cunning folk, or makers of protective charms, occupied important niches in medieval economy. Fear of nighttime supernatural threats thus had economic consequences, shaping how resources were allocated and creating livelihoods for those claiming special knowledge or abilities. The relationship between supernatural beliefs and social control was also significant. Fear of demons and hellfire could be used to enforce behavioral norms, discourage transgression, and maintain hierarchies. Those in authority, whether secular or religious, could invoke supernatural threats to justify their power and suppress dissent. The night, with its supernatural dangers, became a metaphor for moral darkness, reinforcing messages about proper behaviour and the consequences of straying from approved paths. Despite the genuine fear these beliefs generated, they also provided comfort in some ways. The existence of supernatural threats meant that unexplained misfortunes weren't random or meaningless. They had causes, even if supernatural ones, and therefore potentially had solutions. This was psychologically preferable to a universe of pure chaos and randomness. Having demons to blame for problems was, in some sense, better than having no explanation at all. Certain prayers were considered especially powerful against demons and opposing spirits. The prayer of St. Benedict, for instance, was believed to create a spiritual barrier that dark forces couldn't cross. The Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of the Divine, have mercy on me, a sinner, could be repeated continuously as a protective mantra. Some families maintained prayer vigils, with someone staying awake through the night reciting prayers, ensuring unbroken spiritual protection until dawn. This practice was particularly common during times of heightened danger or when illness affected the household. Salt, despite being a common substance, held magical religious significance in medieval culture. Blessed salt could be placed at thresholds to prevent malign entities from entering homes. It might be sprinkled in a circle around a person or space to create a protected area. The combination of salt's practical properties, preservation, purification, and its religious symbolism made it a versatile defensive tool. Some households would create salt barriers around beds before sleeping, especially for vulnerable individuals like infants or the sick. Certain plants and herbs were believed to offer protection against supernatural threats. Garlic, later famous in vampire folklore, was already used in medieval times to ward off bad influences. Rowan trees planted near homes could protect against witchcraft. Hawthorn branches, iron nails, and specific flowers might be hung above doors or windows. These folk traditions existed alongside more formal church teachings, creating a layered system of protection that drew on both official religion and older, sometimes pagan-influenced customs. Physical barriers, while primarily practical, were also imbued with spiritual significance. Thresholds were understood as liminal spaces, boundaries between inside and outside, between safety and danger. Opposing entities supposedly had difficulty crossing thresholds, particularly if those thresholds had been blessed, marked with protective symbols, or reinforced with salt or iron. Doors themselves carried symbolic weight, representing the divide between the secured home and the threatening external world. Ensuring doors were properly closed, locked, and blessed formed part of the nightly protection ritual. Windows required similar attention. Shutters weren't just for keeping out cold air and blocking light, They also prevented malign entities from peering in or entering. Some traditions held that certain creatures, like vampires in later folklore, couldn't enter a home unless invited, making the secured window and door psychological as well as physical barriers. Families might trace crosses on window glass or shutters, adding spiritual reinforcement to physical security. Fire, beyond its practical benefits for light and warmth, held sacred protective qualities. The hearth fire was often blessed, or had prayers said over it. Keeping this fire burning through the night wasn't just about warmth, it was about maintaining a blessed presence in the home. Fire purified, illuminated, and represented the divine light that pushed back darkness. Some families would throw specific herbs or blessed substances into the fire at night, creating smoke believed to be particularly effective at repelling troublesome spirits. The community itself formed a protective network. Neighbours watched out for each other, particularly during times of heightened danger. If someone needed to travel at night, they might organise groups rather than going alone. The knowledge that others were nearby, praying in their own homes, created a sense of collective spiritual defence against whatever darkness might bring. Churches served as refuges, their consecrated grounds offering sanctuary to those caught outside after dark or fleeing danger. Despite all these protections, absolute security remained impossible. The dangers were too numerous, the darkness too deep, the opposing forces too persistent. Medieval people understood that protection was about reducing risk, not eliminating it. Even with every possible precaution in place, things could still go wrong. The best protections might fail against sufficiently powerful threats. And so, alongside the practical measures and spiritual defences, medieval people also cultivated acceptance of danger as an unavoidable part of existence. The teaching of protective practices to children was systematic and began early. Young children would learn simple prayers, how to make the sign of the cross, and basic rules about nighttime behaviour. As they grew older, they'd learn more complex prayers, understand the significance of various protective objects and practices, and develop the spiritual literacy necessary to navigate nighttime dangers. This education was considered as essential as teaching practical skills, recognising that spiritual protection was fundamental to survival. Women often served as primary teachers of protective practices within families. Mothers would pass down prayers, folk remedies, and protective rituals to their daughters, creating lines of knowledge transmission that preserved traditional practices across generations. This gave women significant authority in household spiritual matters, even in a society that generally limited their formal religious roles. The relationship between protection and social status created inequalities. Wealthy families could afford elaborate protections, multiple blessed objects, private chaplains, secure architecture. Poor families had to make do with simpler measures, basic prayers, homemade protective charms, and hope. This meant that nighttime safety, like so many things in medieval society, correlated with wealth and status, adding another dimension to social stratification. Despite these complexities and inequalities, the system of nighttime protections served important psychological functions for medieval people at all social levels. It provided agency in the face of overwhelming threats. It offered hope that proper actions could influence outcomes. It created shared practices that bound communities together. And it gave structure and meaning to the experience of facing darkness, transforming fear from paralysing terror into manageable anxiety that could be addressed through ritual and faith. The legacy of these protective practices persists in various forms. Bedtime prayers, though now often casual, descend from desperate medieval pleas for nighttime protection. Nightlights echo the importance of maintaining light through darkness. Many folk traditions about lucky charms, protective rituals, and spiritual defences trace back to medieval practices. Even people who don't consciously believe in supernatural threats often maintain nighttime routines that reflect deep cultural memory of when such protections were considered essential for survival. The tolling of church bells at night announcing a passing was a sound that sent chills through communities. That mournful ringing in the darkness confirmed fears, marked another loss, reminded everyone of mortality's constant presence. Different patterns of bell ringing indicated different types of departure, the age and circumstances of the deceased, sometimes their social status, allowing people to identify who had passed even before official news spread. Lying in bed hearing those bells, medieval people would pray for the deceased's soul, while also confronting their own mortality. wondering when the bells might toll for them. The cultural practices around mortality, while focused on honouring the deceased and securing their soul's salvation, also served psychological functions for the living. The rituals provided structure during grief, actions to take, prayers to recite, customs to follow. This structure was particularly important at night, when the absence of normal activities and the presence of darkness could make grief overwhelming. Having specific tasks, maintaining the vigil, reciting prayers, preparing the body, kept the bereaved focused and provided a sense of doing something meaningful for the person they'd lost. Funeral customs varied by region and social class, but generally included elements designed to ensure proper spiritual transition. The wake, where family and community gathered with the body before burial, often lasted through entire nights. This served practical purposes, ensuring the person was truly gone and hadn't fallen into a death-like coma, while also providing continuous spiritual protection and communal support. Stories existed of people waking from apparent death, making these extended vigils seem prudent even beyond their spiritual significance. Burial itself had to occur in consecrated ground to give the deceased soul the best chance for salvation. Those denied church burial, criminals, heretics, the excommunicated, those who took their own lives, were buried in unconsecrated areas, their souls believed to be in grave spiritual danger. The location of burial mattered immensely, determining the eternal fate of the soul, and whether the deceased would rest peacefully or become a wandering, troubled spirit. Memorial practices continued long after burial. Specific prayers and masses would be conducted for the deceased soul, sometimes paid for in advance through wills or bequests, ensuring that even years after passing, the community continued to pray for the person's spiritual well-being. Anniversary dates of departures were observed with particular solemnity. All Souls' Day, dedicated to praying for all the faithful departed, became a major observance where communities collectively remembered and prayed for those who had passed. The medieval understanding of mortality, while shaped by genuine faith and theological sophistication, also reflected deep anxieties about the end of life, the afterlife, and what lay beyond the veil of death. The night, with its darkness and mysteries, seemed to mirror death's unknowability. Both removed the familiar and safe, replacing it with uncertainty and fear. Both were inevitable, arriving for everyone regardless of wealth, status, or desire, and both required faith, trust in divine protection and providence, to face without being paralysed by terror. This parallel between night and mortality meant that surviving the darkness each evening was, in a sense, a rehearsal for the ultimate darkness of the end. Going to sleep was described in some medieval prayers as a little death, a temporary loss of consciousness that prefigured the final loss of life. Waking each morning represented resurrection, a new beginning, a gift of continued life. These weren't merely poetic metaphors, but genuine expressions of how medieval people understood their daily existence, as cycles of darkness and light, ending and rebirth, fear and relief. The fear of night, then, was inseparable from the fear of mortality. Both represented the unknown, the dangerous, the transition from comprehensible reality into mystery. And while faith offered hope that passing led to eternal life, the process itself and the uncertainty of what came next remained terrifying. The night, arriving every single day, served as a constant reminder of this mortality, forcing medieval people to confront their fears repeatedly, to seek divine protection desperately, and to be grateful each dawn for another day of life granted by powers beyond their understanding or control. The experience of losing loved ones at night left lasting trauma on surviving family members. The association between darkness and the moment when a beloved person passed created psychological scars that could make future nights even more difficult. Parents who lost children at night might struggle with evening anxiety for years afterward. Those who watched spouses pass in darkness carried that memory through every subsequent night. This accumulated trauma, spread across entire communities that regularly experienced nighttime losses, created a collective cultural anxiety about darkness that went beyond individual experiences. Everyone knew someone who had lost family members at night. Everyone carried stories of such losses. This shared grief and fear reinforced the cultural understanding that night was genuinely dangerous, that the darkness brought not just physical and spiritual threats, but also the possibility of profound personal loss. The medieval concept of the good death emphasised passing during daylight hours, surrounded by family, after receiving last rites and making peace with the world. This ideal reflected the understanding that nighttime passing was less desirable, more dangerous spiritually, more traumatic for survivors. While people couldn't control when mortality would arrive, the cultural preference for daylight passing revealed how deeply the association between darkness and dangerous transition affected medieval thinking. Professional mourners and death attendants who helped families through this process of loss and burial developed their own relationship with nighttime and mortality. These individuals, often women, made their living through attending to the recently departed, preparing bodies, leading prayers, and guiding families through funeral customs. Their repeated exposure to nighttime departures gave them a different perspective, perhaps less fearful than the general population, but also more intimately aware of darkness's connection to life's end. The cumulative effect of all these nighttime losses spread across generations created a medieval culture where darkness was inextricably linked with life's end. The night brought many dangers, but perhaps none was more personally devastating than the possibility that someone loved might not survive until morning. This fear, based on painful experience rather than irrational superstition, gave medieval nighttime anxiety a deeply personal dimension that transcended abstract worries about predators or supernatural threats. Sleep itself presented a unique form of vulnerability during medieval nights. While essential for survival, the state of unconsciousness meant complete defenselessness against whatever dangers might approach in the darkness. Medieval people understood this precarious situation, viewing sleep not as simple rest but as a dangerous necessity that required substantial preparation and protection. Children presented particular concerns. Their small size and innocence made them symbolically and practically vulnerable to supernatural threats. Infants especially required protection, kept close to parents during sleep, sometimes in the same bed despite the discomfort, so that constant physical contact ensured their safety. Protective objects, religious medals, small crosses, blessed items might be placed in cribs or pinned to children's clothing, spiritual armour for those too young to pray for themselves. The sleeping hours posed practical dangers beyond spiritual threats. Fires could start from unattended hearths, potentially consuming sleeping families before they could wake and escape. Poor ventilation was a risk, though not understood in modern terms, causing unexplained losses of entire households found peacefully deceased in their beds. Structural failures, roofs collapsing under heavy snow, walls giving way, could occur at night when no one was awake to notice warning signs. The elderly and infirm faced particular vulnerabilities during sleep. Their increased likelihood of medical crises, combined with medieval society's limited ability to provide emergency care, meant that family members would often maintain closer watch over aged or sick relatives through the night. Sometimes these vigils were simply waiting for the inevitable, staying with someone through their final hours, but other times watchfulness could mean the difference between life and unfortunate outcomes if intervention was needed. Sleepwalking was viewed with suspicion and fear. Someone moving in an unconscious state, unable to respond normally or protect themselves, seemed to be in an unnatural condition, potentially under supernatural influence. Sleepwalkers might injure themselves, wander into danger, or be more vulnerable to demonic possession. Families with sleepwalking members would take special precautions, ensuring doors were secured so the person couldn't leave the house while unconscious, gently guiding them back to bed when episodes occurred, and praying for whatever spiritual or physical ailment caused this concerning behaviour. In the end, sleep represented one of medieval life's great paradoxes. Absolutely necessary for survival, it also created profound vulnerability. Every night, medieval people had to surrender consciousness, relinquishing their ability to protect themselves, trusting in physical barriers, spiritual protections, divine providence, and luck to preserve them until morning. Sometimes that trust was rewarded with safe awakening. Sometimes it wasn't. The uncertainty made every sleep an act of faith, every morning a small miracle, and every night a test of courage that medieval people faced repeatedly, inevitably, eternally, for their entire lives. These practices reflected the understanding that sleep was not a passive state, but rather a time when the sleeper remained vulnerable to outside influences. By attempting to control the conditions of sleep, medieval people sought to protect not just their physical bodies, but also their dreaming minds from harmful spiritual intrusion. The concept of sleep debt existed in medieval understanding, though not in modern physiological terms. People recognised that inadequate sleep made individuals more vulnerable to illness, accident, and spiritual harm. Someone chronically sleep-deprived was understood to be living dangerously, lacking the strength to resist various threats. Yet the very conditions of medieval nighttime often made adequate sleep difficult to achieve, creating a catch-22, where the dangers of night prevented good sleep, and lack of good sleep made people more vulnerable to those same dangers. The teaching of proper sleep practices to children was systematic, recognising that safe sleeping required learned behaviours and attitudes. Children were taught to pray before sleep, to position themselves safely, to keep protective objects nearby, and to wake adults if they experienced frightening dreams or sensed danger. This education began in early childhood and continued through adolescence, gradually building the complex set of behaviours and beliefs necessary for surviving medieval nights. The fear that medieval people felt when night approached wasn't superstitious nonsense or primitive ignorance. It was an entirely rational response to a genuinely dangerous reality. Their world genuinely did contain deadly predators that hunted after dark. Criminals genuinely did operate more freely in darkness. Fires genuinely could destroy homes while families slept. People genuinely did pass away more frequently at night when help couldn't reach them, and they couldn't see threats approaching. The transformation of night from something dangerous to something merely inconvenient represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. The invention of reliable artificial lighting, the establishment of law enforcement and emergency services, the construction of secure housing, the scientific understanding that dispelled supernatural explanations, all these developments gradually stripped away the terrors that had haunted human nights for millennia. Each improvement was a small victory against the darkness that had claimed countless lives and caused immeasurable suffering. Yet something may have been lost in this triumph. Medieval people, facing genuine danger nightly, developed a sense of community interdependence that modern individualism has largely eroded. They understood viscerally that survival required cooperation, mutual protection, and shared vigilance. Their faith, tested every night by real fears, held depth and urgency that comfortable modern belief sometimes lacks. Their appreciation for each new dawn, relief at having survived another night, gave daily life an intensity and gratitude that can be difficult to access when safety is taken for granted. The study of medieval nighttime fears offers perspective on human courage and adaptability. These were people living in circumstances that most modern individuals would find unbearable, yet they persisted. They loved, worked, created art and literature, built magnificent cathedrals, and laid the foundations for the civilization that followed. They did all this while facing every single night a descent into darkness that brought genuine terror, physical danger, and profound uncertainty about whether morning would come for them. Their stories deserve remembrance not as examples of primitive thinking, but as testament to human resilience. They survived not because they were ignorant of dangers, but in spite of fully understanding them. They faced the darkness with whatever tools they had, practical barriers and spiritual faith, and refused to be paralysed by fear even when fear was entirely justified. That courage, that determination to continue living and building futures even in the face of nightly terror, represents something profoundly admirable. For modern people, understanding medieval nighttime fears can foster gratitude for the security so easily taken for granted. The simple act of turning on a light, of walking safely at night, of sleeping without fear of predators or intruders, of trusting that help can be summoned if needed, all these represent privileges that most humans throughout history never experienced. The medieval night serves as a reminder of how much progress has been made and how much easier modern life is in fundamental ways. At the same time, this historical perspective reveals that some human fears are deep and perhaps eternal. The unease in darkness, the alertness to strange sounds, the preference for light over shadow. These aren't just learned behaviours, but seem to be wired into human psychology, evolutionary inheritance from times when nighttime genuinely meant danger. Understanding this can create compassion for those who struggle with nighttime anxieties even in safe modern environments, recognising that these fears connect to deep human history. The medieval experience of night also reminds us that security and safety are not natural states, but achievements requiring constant work to maintain. The infrastructure that makes modern nights safe, electricity, law enforcement, building codes, emergency services, requires ongoing effort and resources. Taking these for granted risks their degradation. The darkness that medieval people feared hasn't disappeared, it has only been pushed back temporarily by human effort and ingenuity that must be sustained. As this long night of exploration concludes, as we step back into modern comfort from the shadows of medieval fear, the central truth remains clear. Medieval people feared the night because the night was genuinely fearsome. Their terror was earned through countless experiences of darkness bringing danger. Their survival through generation after generation of frightening nights represents a triumph of human spirit over circumstance, of courage over fear, of determination over despair. The next time darkness falls, the next time a light switch is flipped or a secure home is entered at night, perhaps there will be a moment of recognition, a brief acknowledgement that this safety is precious, that this light is a gift, that this security was purchased through the suffering and courage of countless ancestors who faced the darkness with far less protection. The medieval night, though centuries past, still has lessons to teach about fear and courage, danger and safety, darkness and light, and the remarkable resilience of human beings facing the unknown. And so, as dawn breaks on this exploration, as light returns to dispel the shadows of medieval fear we've wandered through together, there is comfort in knowing that while the darkness once truly was something to fear, that the nights when every sound brought terror and every shadow hid potential harm are, for most of humanity, finally and blessedly past. The medieval night claimed countless lives and caused immeasurable suffering, but it did not win. Human courage, ingenuity and determination eventually triumphed, transforming night from something to survive into something that can be enjoyed. That victory deserves recognition, celebration, and eternal gratitude to those who endured the darkness so that future generations might walk in light. The medieval people who faced night after terrifying night, who developed intricate systems of protection both practical and spiritual, who taught their children to fear the dark while also showing them how to survive it, who maintained hope and community even in the face of overwhelming nightly danger, these people built the foundations upon which modern safety rests. Every blessing of modern nighttime security, every street light that banishes shadow, every locked door that provides genuine protection, every emergency service standing ready to respond, every scientific understanding that explains away mystery, all of these represent the cumulative achievement of human civilization working across centuries to defeat the terrors that our medieval ancestors faced with such courage. The story of medieval night is ultimately a story of human perseverance. It's a narrative about people who couldn't eliminate danger, but learned to live with it, who couldn't prevent fear but refused to let it paralyze them, who faced the darkness repeatedly throughout their lives and found ways not just to survive but to thrive, to create, to love, to pass down wisdom that would eventually help future generations build a safer world. Their legacy lives in every peaceful night's sleep, every illuminated street, every moment of nighttime security that modern people enjoy without even thinking about it. The medieval night, in all its terror and danger, is finally conquered. And that triumph, hard won across countless generations of brave souls who refused to surrender to the darkness, deserves to be remembered, honoured, and never taken for granted.